Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and today I'm going to talk to you about internet domain names and politics, and what happens when centuries of colonialism collides with the brand new internet. And I'll tell you a little hint. At the end, there's going to be a lot more questions than there are answers. So I want to introduce you to this beautiful little island paradise known as the Chagos Islands. And yes, that really is what it looks like on Apple Maps. That little pink circle down there that looks like a stain in the middle of the ocean, because the amount of land area that's down there is actually very tiny. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, Tom, I've never heard of the Chagos Islands before. And you would probably be right, because much like all those other little island nations that you probably only hear about in YouTube trivia lists, the Chagos Islands are remarkably unremarkable, with the exception of one thing. The Chagos Islands is the home of a U.S. military base known as Diego Garcia. You've probably heard of that one because Diego Garcia is used as a stop-off for any military flights going through the Indian Ocean. Stealth bombers have actually been launched from there to do bombing runs in Afghanistan. It was also used by the CIA for some very less than savory things all the way back in the day. But the important thing is that you have to remember that there is a reason why people are very concerned about the Chagos Islands. No? Here we go. It is also not U.S. territory. Very important to note there. It is actually a British holding. It is the last British holding in the Indian Ocean. You're probably asking yourself, well, how could that have possibly happened? Because at one time, if it was land, Britain wanted it. And, that's why the British Natural History Museum is stocked with the treasures of everybody else's land. Well, it turns out that after 1947, the Brits realized that maybe we should give people their independence. And so they started giving their independence to just about everybody all over the world. In fact, they gave up all of their British Indian Ocean territories, except for one, the Chagos Islands. And part of that reason was because of the United States trying to convince them that they wanted to put a military base there, the aforementioned Diego Garcia. But as we moved into the modern era, circa 1974, all places in the world received a country code that was standardized through ISO. What did the British Indian Ocean Territories country code become? Because you can't have a four-letter country code, and BIOT sounds really weird. So nobody was using IO, and so the country code for the British Indian Ocean Territory became IO. Well, when we created country code top-level domains on the internet back in the 90s, we just adopted what was being used as the country code, and that was .io. That's weird. I've heard of a lot of .io domains, haven't you? A lot of Tech Field Day presenters have used .io domains. You probably thought to yourself, oh, those are vanity domains like .sucks or .shop. In fact, they are not. The very first vanity domains were top-level country codes, which we'll actually talk about in just a couple minutes. But I want you to remember that .io is a real place. And it's a real place that has some drama, because the former British territory of Mauritius, which was a part of the Chagos Islands for a very long time, actually really wanted them back. And they have been asking for them back for over 50 years at this point. Because it turns out that when you need to build a military base, and the people who are running the military base say, we would really like it if there were no more people on this island. The Brits, being the Brits of the 1900s and not the Brits of the 1700s, were like, oh, Don, perhaps we should send them somewhere else. And so they did. They started effectively deporting the entire population of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. Except they didn't tell them they were being deported. They sent them on a steamship, and it's like, oh, you should go visit beautiful Mauritius. And then when they got there, they're like, haha, the ship's not coming back. So the people who have been displaced to the Mauritian Islands have been wanting to go back for 50 years. And the Brits are like, oh no, we're not going to let you do that. However, just this month, Britain finally decided that maybe being a colonizer isn't such a good idea after all. So they have agreed to cede control of the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius, or actually return it where it should have been all this time, in agreement for one of those infamous 99-year leases like they had with Hong Kong, or like we had with the Panama Canal. And so it's all good, right? Well, here's a problem. If The Chagos Islands are no longer the British Indian Ocean Territory and are now part of Mauritius, which has its own country code in ISO. That means that the Chagos Islands are no longer IO, or at least they shouldn't be, right? So what happens when a ccTLD ceases to be a CC? Boy, that's a really fascinating thing, don't you think? Now, you may have seen coverage of this in the news, and you may have heard about this on the rundown this week, but I'm going to dig into a little bit behind the scenes of what's supposed to happen. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of numbers involved, because when a country ceases to be a country, changes its name, or does any of those other things, it needs to be standardized, right? That's why we don't call it Rhodesia anymore. So what happens is that the country code is removed by ISO from ISO 3166-1 Alpha 2, which is also the combination of my luggage. And so what happens is, once the country code is removed, that actually triggers the Internet Assigned Number Authority, IANA, to remove the ccTLD, because IANA's processes require that the country code be listed in ISO. So if I don't have a country code in ISO anymore, it means I no longer have a ccTLD for that, right? So here's what happens. Anybody who currently has that registered gets to keep it, but nobody else can register that domain name. You can't have, like Alistair.io anymore if you didn't already have it. So this creates a little bit of a problem, right? Because how do I deal with this whole situation? And I'll tell you that the reason why this is a very murky situation is because 2 times in the past, IANA has screwed this up. So let me tell you what happens when it goes horribly wrong. So in 1990, IANA created .su for the Soviet Union. You guys remember the Soviet Union, right? Gorbachev, the hammer and sickle, May Day parades, all the cool stuff. You notice the date, 1990? Remember what happened on Christmas Day, 1991? Poof, no more Soviet Union, right? So all of the countries that were created out of the former Soviet Union received their own country code top-level domains, such as Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, all the rest of them. However, IANA said, we are not going to retire .su. We are going to give it to the Russian Federation to operate next to .ru. So they never sunset that. You probably didn't even know that .su was still a top-level country code, right? You know why? Nobody ever goes there, because it's basically like the lawless frontier of the internet, because it really isn't being administered by anybody other than the Russians, and they don't care about it because .ru is their preferred top-level domain name. So if you read articles, you'll find out, holy crap, there's a lot of crazy stuff that goes on out there. It's basically just a vast frontier of cyber criminals. And so the problem is that because .su was ceded to Russia, and Russia doesn't play well with the rest of the world organizations right now, they refuse to sunset it. That's really weird. It'd be good if there was a rule that would allow you to shut that down, right? Well, guess what happens when you do it right? Anybody remember Yugoslavia? Yeah, that's a trip back in the day. Well, as everybody knows, in 1992, .yu was created for Yugoslavia. And then something happened in Yugoslavia, perhaps a giant fracturing of their territory. And .yu was argued because everybody who claimed to be the heir to Yugoslavia wanted .yu. However, Serbia and Montenegro ended up with that domain name. How did they end up with that domain name, you might ask? Funny you should say that, because people from a university actually drove to the University of Belgrade and stole all of the servers that contained the information for .yu and drove them back. 2 years later, IANA broke its own policies and reseeded control of the domain name to the University of Belgrade. Ooh, Yugoslavian drama, I love it. But here's the thing, Serbia and Montenegro actually didn't get along very well with each other either. So when Montenegro declared independence from Serbia, they were allocated 2 new country code top-level domains, .rs and .me, with the provision that you must release and shut down .yu, because they learned their lesson from the Soviets and we're not going to do that crap again. Also, Montenegro ended up with .me. You guys ever seen a lot of .me email addresses? Probably not, because it's actually become a haven for spammers. And so a lot of people just block .me out of habit. So Montenegro was one of the very first vanity domain names. So we fixed the problem, right? Not so much. So here's the conversation that's been going on in the news for the last couple of days. What's going to happen when .io shuts down? Well, the answer right now is not a whole lot, because if anything that moves at the speed of government is going to take years to get sorted out. So we've got to create a formalized process to remove .io from the country code list. That then triggers IANA. They have to have a vote about whether or not to remove it. And we don't know what's going to happen. There's going to have to be a negotiation for what actually occurs when the .io domain gets sunset. But as we've seen in the case of Yugoslavia, IANA has been known to break their own rules before, especially where money is involved. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, why does the country still have to exist in order for me to have that code? And if you are thinking that, you are probably a resident of the nation of Tuvalu. Why? Because Tuvalu's ccTLD is .tv. You've probably been to a .tv site in the past few years. It's because it became a very popular vanity website for TV shows and other forms of entertainment. Tuvalu is an island nation in the Pacific. Tuvalu is an island nation that is sinking. As in, they project within a few decades, Tuvalu will be ocean. And Tuvalu has, I believe it's 9% of their gross domestic product comes from selling .tv domain names. Because I believe they actually have a requirement that one of your servers must be hosted in a Tuvaluian data center in order for you to have that domain name. So they're also making money off of renting you the server. But what happens when the servers need to be able to run underwater because the rest of the nation is underwater? Well, Tuvalu has actually started a process to completely create a digital twin of their country so that it can continue to operate even if the country itself doesn't exist. Probably one of the most forward-thinking things that I've ever heard, and a great way to combat global warming. Just wait until the only time you can visit Tuvalu is through an Apple Vision Pro. So there's already been provisions in place to figure out how we can fix these problems. Yesterday, as of the recording of this, so that would be October 16th, there was a news story that Anguilla, which is a British overseas territory in the Caribbean, guess which country code they ended up with? .ai. You thought .io was hot 10 years ago? You ain't seen nothing yet. They make 20% of their revenue from selling .ai domain names. They just transferred control of their domain names to Identity Digital, which is the same group that organizes a bunch of other top-level domains, like .org. So Anguilla is figuring out very quickly that A, they don't have the bandwidth to be able to provide domain names for this land rush, but B, what's going to happen when we're not a country anymore? Because there is a very real possibility that now that the Chagos Islands have been ceded back to Mauritius, that a lot of other independence movements are going to spring up, and some of those other overseas territories are going to want their independence. And now it looks like they could very well get it. But here becomes the other problem. Could I create a bidding war for some of these territories? Because I promise you, somebody is going to be willing to pay a small fortune to be able to control who has .ai addresses. Because there's enough money in the AI industry right now to be able to get a lot of that. Now here's the interesting part about the whole thing. Country code top-level domains are a very tricky intersection of politics and tech, simply because there is a mandated process for how these things are created, how they are maintained, and how they are retired when a country changes names, changes ownership, or something else happens. And the problem is that we just assume that all websites will exist forever, much like Space Jam. Go Google the original Space Jam website. I hope you're running Macromedia Shockwave player because it's the only way you can see anything on it. But everybody wants a vanity URL. Why? Because most of the .com names are already taken. There's a reason why my email address is tom@networkingnerd.net and not tom@networkingnerd.com. Bender, I want that domain name. But more importantly, as those domain names become more and more available, so the only thing that I can do is register techfieldday.ai or techfieldday.me, they know it, and they're using it as a massive source of income, especially if it's a developing area that doesn't have a whole lot of other things going for it. And so you're running into these really tricky problems where Montenegro is known as a haven for spammers because we need the money. It also creates some assumptions about countries. And there are a lot of those assumptions that we have to deal with. For example, most of us in this room grew up with a map that included a country named Burma. Burma doesn't exist anymore. That's Myanmar. Countries change names all the time. Countries are created, countries are removed. It's actually very difficult to figure out how many countries there are currently in the world, because it also depends on if you agree whether or not this place is actually a country or if it's just a territory in rebellion. When do we create a ccTLD? It's a really good question. Is it when they join the UN? There are actually countries that are not parts of the UN for a variety of reasons. And also, what happens to dead domain names? Because it's actually very rare that we've killed off domain names, because we just believe that the internet should exist pretty much everywhere, right? Except for those times when a country disappears, or we shut down a testing domain name, or somebody finally realizes that .sucks is not the vanity URL that you want. Most people know that the reason why they created that was so that the company could buy their own domain name, like mcdonalds.sucks, and redirect to mcdonalds.com, right? It's a cash grab. But that's the world that we live in today, where people are more interested in getting their own top-level domain, no matter what it might be, and trying to figure out how to make it all work. If you are interested in hearing about the history of the Chagos Islands and the kinds of bastardry that happened to get a military base on it, I highly recommend the episode of Behind the Bastards from this June. It's a two-part series talking all about what the British did to get the Chagos Islands, how they managed to move the entire population off, and what happened when the US moved in and decided to build a military base. I'll give you a hint. If you're a pet fan, do not listen to the second part of that. You're not going to like it. I also recommend that entire podcast anyway, because they have some great stuff.